So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Associate Professor Cameron Logan and Architect Matt Devine. Cameron is an urban and architectural historian, an Associate Professor in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the university. He's the Chief Investigator on the Arc Discovery Project Locating Jogola, and author or co-author of 3 books, including Historic Capital, Preservation, Race and Real Estate in Washington, D.C., published in 2017, and Adapt, New Lives for Old Buildings, published in 2024. Matt Devine is a heritage specialist in the strategic planning team at the City of Sydney, a registered architect and a lecturer in heritage conservation, again here at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. In 2021, he was the David Scott Mitchell Fellow at the State Library of New South Wales, during which time he researched the life and work of Edward H. Farmer, the New South Wales state government architect in the period when the Fisher Library was designed and built. Today, they're discussing the design of the Fisher Library, the building you're sitting in, referring to a set of 25 architectural drawings used in the library's construction in the early 60s. This collection was a gift to the library last year from the estate of architect Kenneth Paul, coinciding with the library's, the building's 60th anniversary. So please welcome Cameron and Matt.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for coming, everyone. Just to echo Julie's acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and I also want to thank Anne Goodfellow, who's been a tremendous collaborator in putting this together, but also the exhibition just over here that myself and colleague Hector Abrahams have curated for Fisher Library. So if you get a chance to have a look at that or come to the associated programming, do that as well. But we're not going to talk about Hardy Wilson today, unfortunately, because I spent a bit much time on him of late. We're going to talk about this building, and what I want to begin, I suppose, by sort of doing is just to sort of acknowledge what the building might have meant for the university, and then I want to contextualise it in a couple of ways. First, with respect to how the site works and why it's here, and how that's quite important for the way this campus works, and then talk about widen the view a bit and look at libraries and university libraries and how they were sort of playing a new role in universities across Australia. So that's kind of how I want to set it up. Now I'm going to hand over to Matt, and we're going to walk through the building a bit more closely in reference to the drawings themselves. So there's a quote up there is from a very nice publication called Australian Modern from 2019, for which I wrote the entry on the Fisher Library. There are 50 individual entries on significant 20th century buildings from between 1925 and 1975. And I wrote the one on the Fisher Library, and in that, when I went to shop my own wardrobe, as they say, to find some stuff for this talk, I unearthed this quote, which is to note that the new library marked a transition from an older conception of this institution as a privileged enclave of scholarship and elite networking towards a modern, knowledge-centred public resource. So the library itself really is, in a sense, a marker in the history of the university, I'd suggest. Okay. So let's go back a bit, talk a bit about where it is and how it got to be in this particular lovely location. Basically, this is a 1932 campus plan, and I can point with this. This is the boundary at that time of Victoria Park. You can ignore that darker line. I'm a bit unclear about what that's doing on this map. Anyway, that's a mystery to be unpicked. But basically, you can see the boundary of Victoria Park at that time. And so it included areas that are now within the bounds of the university, including right here and down to our east, looking down that way.
Can we just mention that previously the university had given a parcel of land that was the bulk of Victoria Park to the city?
Yeah, so I'm about to say that.
Okay, sorry.
So in this aerial, from almost certainly from during World War II, you can see not Castle, Madsen, under semi-constructed, which was done in 2 phases during World War II, so this is almost certainly during World War II. The university originally had its entrance, as many of you will know, down here, and this was university land leading up to the Eastern Range and Great Hall. And this land here was sort of a bit of a no man's land, but it belonged formerly to the city in that period. Between the 1920s and the 1930s, at some point in that process, there was the land was swapped. And the city got this land down in this corner, which now belongs and is managed by the city as Victoria Park, and the university got this land across which it developed a series of buildings from Carslaw down to here, and eventually, of course, the museum, although that was within the old part there. And so here in the drawings from the period where the building was constructed, you can see here, and this is there's your north orientation, and here's the library, and you can see this is the first building that moves off the top of the ridge and onto this slope on this part of that was originally sort of part of, or the bit of land that was belonged to the city. Okay, so that's the kind of how it got to be here, and it's really important in a way for what happens and the evolution of Eastern Avenue and a series of things that really make what we have as the campus today. This building is the beginning of that process. Okay, so the other key contextual matter that I mentioned relates to the situation of university libraries in the post-war decades. And there's a quote here from the Australian Universities Commission, what's known as the Murray Report from 1957. It said, "It should be unnecessary to stress the importance of the library to the whole framework of university education. In arts, law and social sciences, the library fills the place of the laboratory. The library must be found by the student to be a place where he is welcomed and encouraged to pursue personal and independent search for knowledge and understanding." And she, as it turns out. But the point here being, there was also a rethinking of the role of the library right at this moment, and a very clear acknowledgement that the library had been ignored to the detriment of Australian universities for some decades. And so this initiated a period, and so by the beginning of the sort of middle decades of the 20th century, the universities had sort of long harboured plans to actually develop their libraries, but for various reasons, depression, war, usual sorts of explanations, they hadn't realised these ambitions, and resources were always directed elsewhere to teaching spaces, laboratories, for example, and even to library resources, but not to the libraries institutionally and their buildings. And so they often occupied makeshift spaces that were largely, that were intended usually for other purposes. And in the late 1950s, Harrison Bryan, the head librarian at Fisher Library in that period, before this building was constructed, concluded that Australian university libraries, I beg your pardon, were largely, and I quote, undistinguished in quality and indifferently conducted. So his ambition was to up the game of libraries, and building this building was part of it. So the 1957 Murray Report, which I mentioned, recommended a major expansion of the tertiary education sector in Australia and gave renewed call to renewed the call to sort of prioritise the library as a key element of university campuses in Australia. So while the Murray Report mentioned that it should be unnecessary to stress the centrality of the library, clearly it was necessary because it had been neglected. And the report was a catalyst for a substantial wave of library building. From 1957 to 1978, Australian universities built more than 25 central libraries. And you'll all recognise some of these. Quick visual test. And you get elephant stamp if you can name one. No? Okay. Melbourne, yes, that's the Bailey Library. Well done, yeah, okay. Two.
Queensland.
Yeah, UQ in the bottom right. Reed Library, UWA, yes.
And the Cokie Library at Sir James Court.
Well done. Winner goes to the librarian. So real phase of library building. You can see too that it's a moment too where I guess ushers in a sort of new language of architecture for universities in this period, and this is happening across campuses, but the libraries are sort of a key element of that, not regarded ever as being the kind of generic background buildings that sometimes the faculties and classroom sort of spaces were, but as a sort of dual building in a sense. It would be foregrounded as a sort of special place on most campuses in this period. And it's worth also noting that that wasn't just a matter of sort of formal expression or of indeed the sort of upgrading of amenity and technology and so forth for the way they function. It was also a sort of civic or social idea embedded in the library from that period, and that Dennis Winston, the first professor of town planning at this university, who was very involved in the discussion around campus planning and design, emphasised that a library should be part of that group, that so-called core group of buildings on a university campus that was the place one sort of remembered fondly in years hence, and as a sort of social setting for the sort of life of the campus, if you like. And the library, along with the union, which was an incipient institution this period, will be the key sort of buildings for that, along with other, one or two other, university administration buildings or whatever. So that's a kind of wider context in which this building came about. There's as I said, there's the campus itself taking shape in a different form in this particular sort of terrain, and then there's this shift in policy, and there's a development of the library as going to be central to the sort of expanding period of universities, the expansion era. And I'm showing you here, of course, a picture of Macquarie University and its library as that campus emerged on sort of former farmland in North Ryde, and you can see the library there, and positioned along that central, what's known as Wally's Walk now, and there was very much this conception there of the library as anchoring the sort of core or the heart of the university, which was echoing thought about town planning and the remaking of cities as settings for social interaction in this period. And so the campuses were conceived as part of that, like little cities into themselves with their own civic life. And if you want to read all about this in much more detail, please do in this book, Campus Building Modern Australian Universities, from a research project of which I was part and wrote some of the chapters in this book, a very nicely illustrated volume too, if you like looking at pictures of universities from 50s and 60s. It's not just about 50s and 60s, but that is kind of the core focus, this period we're talking about today. Of course, the immediate architectural context for this project, and the one Matt's going to talk about right now, is the chemistry building, which was taking shape in the years immediately before this building was designed. And while it sat within the traditional university territory, it was again moving in that direction down what we now know as Eastern Avenue, and feels like a sort of coherent development. But of course, if you look at what it looked like in 1958-9, it was a pretty ad hoc movement of buildings, or it seemed to be at the time. It's also done by the Government Architect's Office and involves one of the architects who would be central to design of this place. And it's a technically sophisticated building in the sense it uses modern construction technique as well as the sort of language of modern architecture in a very stark way that chemistry really supported as a sort of exemplar of sort of, I guess, the modernity of materials and technology. And so that sort of set the scene for this project, and it did so in one particularly resonant way that we'll note, in that just 2 years after this building was completed, the heat gain on the eastern elevation of this building was so pronounced that they had to find some sort of fix for it. And so just as they were sort of doing that, and Ken Woolley, who's one of the architects of this building, was detailing this set of operable louvers for the front of the building at the same time as he was designing or involved in the design of and the detailing of the Fisher Library. So finally we arrive here.
So this is a perspective that's part of the set of drawings that were recently donated. And it shows the original concepts for the building, which was based on the brief by the new university librarian, where you would have one part of the building for researchers and one part of the building for undergraduates. The main sort of players in the story are the Government Architects branch, who at that time was initially under Cobden Parkes and later under Ted Farmer, and a particular design architect in that office, Ken Woolley, and another firm of architects called Tom, with the principal architect of Tom Omani. And Omani and the government architect were asked to design the building in collaboration. A little bit of confusion as to who was going to be given what responsibility. And there were two schemes, initial concept schemes, one by Ken Woolley and one by Tom Marnie, that was presented to the university librarian. And Omani came up with the idea of two very distinct components of the building, with an entrance in between. And then that was subsequently developed by Woolley into the scheme that we have in front of us, which was two separate components, but with actually a lower section in the middle with a 3-story atrium in that middle component. So that was a revised sketch plan by Woolley. It's interesting with the drawings we've got, that authorship is still always slightly conflicted because all of the drawings have the signature of the government architect on it and the signature of Omani. Though it's interesting, Woolley does get attribution of this building principally, which Omani and his former later business partners fought against for a long time. At the same time, we need to talk a little bit about Kenneth Paul, who donated the drawings that are here. He worked with Omani briefly, and according to his daughter, who donated these drawings, he prepared these drawings. We're not, as I said, the signatures on the drawings make that a little bit unclear. Kenneth Paul actually didn't stay working with Omani for much longer after this, and then he went off to a very large commercial firm called Thompson, Glendinning and Paul, and developed a particular reputation for designing hospitals and advising World Health Organization and the ACT on hospital development, and did a lot, particularly community work in the Upper North Shore area, and received, he was a fellow of the Institute of Architects and received an OAM for services to the community and to architecture. How do we? So this is a model we found a photo of, which pretty much shows the scheme as it was built, except we're intrigued by these structures in the forecourt. But otherwise, two separate units, a smaller bit in between, and the interesting form of the undergraduate wing with its deep projecting eaves, and also one thing that you might note of something that wasn't built, some sun shading screens on that western elevation, which we believe is probably in response to what the response Ken Woolley had to the chemistry building. Here's a detail of these sunscreens, which definitely weren't installed. So vertical metal louvers, and then these very elegant screens with sort of perforations. Here you can see that the character of the building as it was built. This is the northeast corner, so the lowest level, the lowest corner, and the projecting eaves. The projecting eaves were also a sun shading device. It's interesting that there's also been some consideration that maybe there was some influences of Japanese architecture with that form.
We're going to sort of walk a bit through the plan now, and I was just going to use this drawing to note, in a sense, because of what I said about the site before, and this is the first building that falls off the top of the top part of the ridge, and most of the university, or the original part of the university, is built between two hollows in a way on that high ridge for obvious sort of reasons. But you see sort of what's clever in the way this, the way you can sort of see here is that you ever enter into the middle level, which actually provides quite an important functional thing in that it means people are able to move up and down easily. If you're at the library at Monash or various other universities, some of the ones that were shown from this period, you're entering the level and you're very dependent on lifts, much more so than here. So it's actually quite clever in terms of planning to use that way of entering at the middle level, although it has caused some confusion over the years in terms of the naming of levels. So it used to be basement, lower ground, ground 1, 2. Of course, now we have just 1 to 5. So people entering on 3 sometimes may face some confusion. And what else were we going to say about this drawing? Anything?
Nothing.
No? Okay. So then just to show you a plan of the entrance.
Yeah,
We're gonna
so,
talk about that.
yeah, so this is the entrance level. So you all would have come in through this lobby area. This is the area which has the 3-story atrium. It's interesting, you can see the planning here already. You've got essentially the central form, which is an open space on some upper and lower levels. There's some other small areas, but then you've got the services clustered in one section with the stair and toilets, another pair of fire stairs, and then something that, even though the building was built in 2 stages, they actually built the lift and fire stair that was going to become part of the stack, and they built it to the complete height, which this photo shows, which I think is really interesting. This is very soon after opening. You can see we didn't get the screens on that western facade, but I can't believe I'd never actually registered that the fire stair and lift stack was already built, because it was several years after that that the stack was finished. So here's a more detailed shot of that lobby and the tall atrium. And this is before occupation of the building, where you can get a sense of the character and also some of the materials of this beautiful space. This is actually lower ground, which is the level we are on now. And this level was where the University Librarian's office was. So literally where we are now, this was the University Librarian's office. And then the space opposite is now the exhibition area, which was various storerooms and a part of the stack. You might also want to note that there is the balcony here, the only balcony in the building, and of course that is given to the University Librarian.
Do you have a balcony now, Philip?
And let's go to the next one, because so here's a detail of what would have been Philip's office if it was still in this location. And next one. And here you can see a detail of that balcony. So lower ground, overlooking Victoria Park. Yep. This is essentially a typical floor where most of the large areas of books and reading desks, some smaller sort of spaces to be used. But what we think is particularly interesting about this one is that there is a music room in this location with some pods for private listening, and this music room here. And we think this is kind of how the library is offering more things than it would have in the past. We think we were having conversations about trying to date these based on hairstyles and fashions. I thought the music room looked pretty cool. One of them said it was 1980s, and I was thinking, well, maybe early 80s for the one on the right. But it just shows typical spaces and how they were used within the library. And then this is probably early to mid 80s, about the time I probably turned up here.
Based on her jumper.
Yeah, based on her jumper. And so this was when the catalogue was first available on a computer. It does say online catalogue, but it's not online in the way we think now. It was online in that you could, type in the details into that computer, but we're still way before the internet.
But I guess the overall thing here is the range of uses projected from the late 50s and early 60s. Student hub, amenity, technological sophistication, a variety of use, not just a set of sort of books held, gathering dust, was kind of the idea. And these pictures, taken of course for the library probably to promote itself at various times, but anyway, highlight in a sense the realisation of that changed conception of the university as a public resource as opposed to sort of a closed scholarly community. We just thought this one was quite interesting because this is the roof level. The open roof area that has only
it was only reopened last year, and in this instance you can see the skylights over the atrium.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, there.
Okay.
The other thing we thought was worth pointing out was some of the drawings indicate some of the particular details in the construction, and there was always a great sense of making that the building would have high quality products, very contemporary products, but high quality products and details. So there are full-size timber handrails, moulded plastic handrails, most of which are still here. These are some of the battens to display case walls. We have other drawings that indicate there was battening around the atrium. And most of that is still around, and even in more recent works where new components have been added, there's an attempt to replicate that character with some of the sort of newer timber panelling. The other thing, we also use of glass mosaic tiles, very popular in that time. Think of the stairwell and columns on a lot of the levels. Was that the last one?
Yep. Yeah. So really that, in a sense, those details pick up, you see the sort of, if you go in chemistry, which most of you probably don't, but it's worth doing, you see it's a sort of proving ground for the detailing of this building. And this is probably a bit more warmer and I guess more sort of humane in a sort of stereotypical sense. And Willie was very interested in Alvar Aalto, the great Finnish architect, was famous for the sort of warmth of his modern detailing and the kind of craftsman-like quality, even though in sort of industrial production. And he was a great admirer of Artec, the design company that came out of Aalto's practice. And so there is that quality for those sort of design buffs will be able to recognise that kind of resonance in the library as well. And I think it's of great value, and I hope the university will always see the value in that kind of design legacy and be sure to protect and preserve it.
Omani mentioned that while his office did the majority of the documentation and then gave the drawings to the Government Architects Branch and Public Works to build, Ken Woolley was still finessing, detailing right up until the last, pretty much up until the last minute. And a lot of those details you see here were actually explored further in probably one of his greatest projects, which was the State Office Block, which was built very soon after and demolished about, 15 years ago. And then this is soon after completion of the stack, which was completed in 68, did we say? And so you can see the lift core that had been built for the first stage of the library is completely enclosed in the bronze cladding. And this is pretty much the library as you see it today.
I think that's it. We've gone over time, so we'll end there. Thanks, folks.
Perhaps we could throw the structural engineer under the bus and ask who actually engineered those corners that I can see deflecting outside.
Oh, yes. I am not aware if the Government Architects Branch had engineers at that time, so I'm not sure who the engineer was. It's probably not that surprising because those slabs are pretty thin, and we know a lot more about concrete reinforcement now than we did then. So I don't think we need to prop them up just yet.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it does. I hear differing kind of feedback on that particular issue. It's obviously not a disaster, so it's sort of. But maybe just in terms of the sort of perfection of the geometry, sometimes it feels a bit like, oh, I just wish it was just a bit right.
But also generally speaking, what do you see as the influences of this building? Because it isn't really particularly like a Ken Woolley building. It's almost like a Bryce Mortlock building, but I guess it's a mixture of different people. The other thing that's really, it's a great building, but the other thing that's a little bit jarring is that rock-faced sandstone wall along the basement, which is, kind of classical illusion almost in.
I expect that's probably just a response to the principally sandstone nature of a lot of the campus at that stage. It's not the sort of it does kind of diminish the sort of, the purity of the building. And it's interesting, we talk more about Bryce Mortlock later. Ken Woolley, within a few years of completing this project, he went to join a firm that was called Anchor Mortlock, Murray and Woolley. But Bryce Mortlock was already in that firm, I believe, prior to Woolley joining them. So maybe those Bryce Mortlock projects are actually had influences Ken Woolley. I do think Ken Woolley in particular, a lot of it is the internal finishes that we're seeing are particularly Ken Woolley, particularly as I said, in sort of State Office Block. When the State Office Block was demolished, there was actually a selection of materials taken as part of the archival recording of that building, and there's some of the elements are almost exactly the same as had been reused about a year or so later in the State Office Block.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting point about what the building is. It's very, for Woolley, who's known for his own house, for particular, obviously for the State Office building as well, but in some ways in architectural history, he gets his own house and this sort of nuts and berries thing, sense of texture, relationship to nature. This is a very prismatic sort of building, geometrically organised, not the sort of informality that's associated with both the plan and section of that building. Mm-hmm. So it is, it doesn't, I guess, look like what he's known for, in work for tertiary education. His union building in Newcastle, which also has some of those other qualities, that sense of natural material, expressed natural material, maybe greater sense of informality, is also quite distinct in a sense from the language here. So it is curious, but I think you're probably right. It's partly to do with the fact that this is officially a government architects project and in collaboration with Omani. So in a sense, when we look at that, we're not necessarily looking at like Woolley's signature, if that's what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Also, the bronze cladding that was just a standard public works cladding, wasn't? Although, is this one slightly different? Is that B25 cladding?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's very similar because we know that Peter Hall used bronze detailing in his extension to the Land Titles building. So the use of bronze at the time was becoming relatively common. There was quite a lot of bronze used in some of the buildings at UNE soon after.
Prince of Wales Hospital. Yeah. And also State Office Block.
Yeah.
Of course.
So in State Office Block, entirely the black box, because it was the bronze had coloured. I actually think what we're seeing more is an Omani volume and scheme with finessing by Woolley.
It's a great building to work in. It's a lovely building. Thanks. The rectangular shape and the glass walls, etc., always occurred to me as representing Mies van der Rohe's influence. I was wondering if you agree with that.
I think it's more of a case of there was probably no architect after about 1940 that had no influence of Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe sort of is kind of one of the defining elements of modernism. Yeah. And so this is an Australian version of that.
Yeah, it's classic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the undergraduate or the main section, it does, I think, about it. Yeah. So there's a question here and then one over here.
Oh, can I ask a question about the cladding? Because it was copper coloured and they used to refer to it as the copper cladding. So is it not copper?
It's bronze.
Oh. And then...
Which is why it kind of has patinated so dark. Copper tends to go a bit greener. And patinated so dark. And I do recall when I was here as a student, people using Brasso for graffiti.
Recently we were trying to find a picture of it before it discoloured.
Yeah, it would have coloured up pretty quickly.
Thanks.
Do you know why the louvers on the west weren't built?
We don't. In fact, I think that seeing these drawings was the first time either Matthew or I, who both looked at the building in some detail before to write something or talk about it, and had never seen that, and that perspective, that's our front cover, was the first time we'd noticed it, or no, that was we noticed it actually on the elevation drawing.
And then we look closely.
And then looked closely and saw that it was part of that. So the west elevation, I think, is where we first noticed it. Like, oh, okay. So it's not clear to me. One can only assume that they just thought that the overhangs would do enough, and it wasn't, the impact of the heat gain wasn't going to be of the kind that where the inhabitants were going to straight away go, oh, no way, we can't have this, like, because that's what happened with the east elevation in chemistry.
These are also very early drawings. So these are, that perspective was probably done very soon after the concept was agreed. And we have two versions of a couple of plans, but there would have been quite a few iterations after these drawings.
I think it would be really interesting to find out if it was a pencil sharpening exercise or whether it was an architectural kind of argument around clarity and purity. Yeah. In regards to thinking about the development of Glenn Murcutt's work, which would have been heavily influenced by these types of buildings going up, a modernism that hadn't yet been designed appropriately for the Sydney or the Australian climate.
Well, there was a very lively discussion happening within Public Works in this period about that. They'd built a couple of schools with glazed curtain walls, and they built a chemistry building with a glazed curtain wall. And it's actually Farmer who comes down hard and eventually says, no, we're not doing glazed curtain walls in Sydney, it's Public Works. So in other words, we're going to explore other solutions to sort of modern rational language of architecture that don't involve simply laying very thin curtain wall solution over a frame, which is what you have more in chemistry, although some of the elevations actually have precast concrete panels as well. So I think it is part of a discussion that is underway by the end of the 50s about climate and climatically appropriate responses. And there are other sort of famous instances from the period. Bates Smart did the MLC building in North Sydney, orienting the main elevations east-west. There's huge heat gain. That's now state heritage listed, and there's complaints about whether that building could ever function in a thermally satisfactory way, etc., etc. So there was quite a few projects that had initiated this discussion, and of course there were very famous international discussions from really World War II period, Le Corbusier and others, about working in tropical environments, or especially the Ministry of Education building in Sao Paulo, which is kind of an icon in architectural history, which uses a brise soleil, uses a screen to protect the windows from direct sunlight. And so it is an ongoing discussion about how you're going to use actual architectural devices as opposed to mechanical ventilation to temper buildings. And I think this is kind of just this set of things, as well as the post-installed louvers on chemistry, are all sort of part of that story. But yeah, the more detailed part, we don't know the answer.
Thanks very much. I think too, from talking to Ken Paul's daughter when she gave us this gift, that these were quite early drawings and that they were not necessarily the final drawings. I think Matt sort of said that, even looking at some of them, I could see that they were changed. These were working drawings, so it may have been, I don't know whether it was a very firm decision or not to remove but I just think they're so beautiful, and I wish that they had been there. The other thing that's sort of gone is the breezeways, or the entries as well. So there's the other
canopy too that was in. So Matt, there's one you can see there, which is just as a sort of flat, and then there's the one in the model, which was a bit more articulated as a sort of roof structure. But yeah, that's something that obviously there's no image where anything was constructed out there, but obviously it was an attempt to sort of project out and provide that sort of plaza-like quality with a bit of environmental amenity that I was talking about with relation to what Dennis Winston said, and was trying to make these gathering places and to encourage that by using this sort of device like this. I mean, I think the trees do quite a bit of that work now, along with that other, perhaps slightly overscaled cafe building there. But but yeah, no sign that anything was ever done to actually try and create that entrance sequence.
And the photos of the opening of the building in 1963 does not have the louvers, the vertical louvers on above the entry,
Okay.
but they're there now. So I'm not sure why they weren't there right at the very beginning, but they may have been, work in progress. But the other thing, going back to the comment about the bronze and also the comment about the stone along the front, I mean, there's also some quite beautiful stone work on the back, on the lower level, which is quite a strong
rusticated kind of stone,
statement. But I also agree about the sort of difference of the modernity, contrasting with the past.
Yeah.
But obviously, the sandstone probably was a salute to the quad.
Obviously there was chemistry. It was down there, and there was some idea that they'd been trying, and Madston is kind of a bit of a compromised building with respect to the main original grouping. But they'd sort of boldly said, no, we're going for the sort of language of modern architecture there. But even, Wilkinson sort of, who'd influenced the campus right up until the sort of mid-50s, was very interested in the ways in which the kind of idea of public decorum with respect to the original language, and sort of transitions away. He wants to do his building, which is a different language, physics, a bit away, but as he moves away, he includes elements that start to look a bit like his language of architecture, but still include the sort of sandstone detailing, a sort of nod to the collegiate Gothic, and he builds a little Baxter's Lodge down here. And of course, he's an architect who's sort of committed to a sort of traditional language in general, but there is that assumption, and it's really chemistry that shifts the idea. But I think they were still engaged in thinking, no, like finely detailed, beautifully realised modern building can still be involved in that conversation, but maybe some material reference is one of the ways you can sort of ground it, or I guess open up that dialogue. But I kind of tend to agree that those sort of blind up, or not blind openings, whatever, however you describe that, that wall, that west ground level wall, that always strikes me as sort of slightly funny note in the building too.
And also on that same line, the thing that's interesting is that the sort of nod to the previous Fisher Library, because you had the metal roof on that, and then the metal cladding and the sandstone obviously there, but also the fact that the stack or the research library was at right angles to the reading room in what is now McLaurin Hall.
Yeah.
It was deliberately built at right angles.
Right.
And it's sort of interesting that we ended up with the same sort of schema, even though it was a much more modern building.
Okay, it's an interesting thought. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that spatial connection to McLaurin, or to the old Fisher, actually. Thanks, Phil.
That's all we've got time for today. So please come and take a look, and join me again in thanking.
Oh, that's